July 24th, 1943. The North Sea wind hissed against the dunes near IJmuiden, carrying the salty breath of the occupied Dutch coast into the low huts of Würzburg Stellung Berta 7. Inside, the air smelled of dust, ozone, and machine oil. The Freya radar set hummed, its cathode ray tube glowing a dim, steady green in the blackout gloom. Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Bremer leaned close to the circular screen, eyes narrowed, the phosphorescent trace sweeping clockwise in disciplined rotation. For months the picture had been predictable, single contacts crawling inland, the heartbeat of the sky rendered into geometry. Tonight, the pattern was madness. Contact bearing 210 to 225, range 180 kilometers, he said, his voice trembling. Lieutenant Otto Kranz, duty controller for the night watch, looked up from his plotting board. How many? Bremer swallowed. More than 50. Maybe 70. Kranz frowned. 70 heavy bombers do not appear out of the sea, Bremer. Check your gain, your elevation filter. The younger man twisted the dials, hands slick with sweat. All correct, Herr Lieutenant. Kranz rose, boots creaking on the wooden floor, and bent over the scope. The Freya early warning radar, Germany's pride, operating on a wavelength of 2.4 meters, had given the Luftwaffe mastery of the night sky since 1940. From Norway to France, the Kammhuber Line stretched across Europe like a chain of invisible fences. Each zone, or Himmelbett, paired a Freya set for detection with a Würzburg radar for precise tracking, feeding data to searchlights and night fighters waiting to pounce on British bombers. The system had worked flawlessly until now. Kranz's stomach turned cold. The green blips marched inward in perfect formation, far too regular to be weather, far too symmetrical to be coincidence. Würzburg, confirm tracks, he ordered. In the next truck, Funkmart Vogel's voice came through the intercom. We have 4 plots. No, 6, 8. I can't. He stopped. Static filled the line. Kranz glanced toward the Würzburg dish outside the great parabolic antenna turning like a clockwork moonflower. It was meant to track one target precisely, sometimes 2. Never 6, never 8, never scores at once. Repeat, Vogel. There are hundreds, Herr Lieutenant. The words froze the room. Bremer whispered. Hundreds? As though naming a curse. He had heard the legends of British mass raids, of 1,000 bomber nights over the Ruhr. But those fleets formed over hours. They never appeared fully grown on the scope like a conjured storm. Kranz clenched his fists. Signal Jag Division. Priority intercept. Bearing 210 through 240. Altitude Angels 20. The radio operator began shouting coordinates. Across the dark coast, the order rippled through the Kammhuber network. Sirens wailed on distant airfields. In the huts of night fighter crews, pilots stumbled awake, pulling on flight suits still stiff with sweat and oil. Mechanics primed engines. The great twin-engined Junkers, Ju-88s and Messerschmitt 110Cs coughed to life, propellers biting into the night. Back in Berta 7, Bremer stared at the Freya tube. The green circle bloomed like a malignant flower. Each sweep brought new echoes. 90, 100, 150, 200. He could not mark them fast enough. His plotting board became a smear of grease pencil arcs and dots. Range decreasing, he said hoarsely. Altitude? Kranz asked. All the same, Angels 20. That was impossible. No formation, however disciplined, flew at a mathematically identical altitude. The British were precise, but not mechanical. Something else was at work. Outside, the sky was clear and star-stained. Searchlights probed nothing. The horizon was empty, yet on the screens the enemy advanced like a green tide. Vogel called from the Würzburg hut. Lock lost, targets fading and reappearing, interference across the band. Kranz stepped to the field telephone, his pulse hammering. Confirm Sector 220. Do you have visual contact with bombers? A distant controller's voice crackled through. Negative. Nothing seen. Searchlights have empty sky. Kranz felt the chill deepen. Check again. Nothing. Only stars. The lieutenant lowered the handset slowly. The Freya still screamed of invasion, scores of echoes pressing inland toward Bremen, Hanover, the Ruhr. Every instrument insisted the Reich was under attack. Every human eye said otherwise. Could it be atmospheric reflection? Bremer ventured. Kranz shook his head. He had spent 3 years in the radar service, studied the textbooks, trusted the physics. Ground clutter, ducting, auroral interference, none produced tracks like these, uniform in altitude, marching with mechanical precision. On the far end of the room, the duty logbook lay open, the night's entries neat and ordered. Bremer lifted his pencil, hesitated, then wrote, "Multiple contacts, bearing 210. Altitude constant." Possibly he stopped. There was a word for it, whispered among technicians, forbidden to appear in official reports. Störsender, jammer. He stared at the page. No one dared write it. To accuse the enemy of jamming was to admit the unthinkable that the English had found a way to make radar, the Reich's proudest weapon, blind. Outside, engines roared into the night. Dozens of German fighters clawed upward into empty air. They would find nothing. The phantom bombers would march across the screens until dawn, vanish at the edge of range, and leave behind only questions. By morning, headquarters would demand explanations: faulty calibration, moisture in cables, operator error. But among the men of Berta 7, a new fear had taken: route. The machines were lying. Kranz stood over the Freya console, watching the sweep paint its false sky. The green light flickered across his face, hollowing his eyes. He remembered the briefings from 2 years earlier, when the Kammhuber Line was first built. The general had promised invulnerability. "Our radar," he said, "gives us eyes that never sleep." Now those eyes were dreaming. "Shut down the transmitter," Kranz ordered quietly. "Herr Leutnant?" "Do it." Bremer reached for the switch. The hum faded to silence. The screen went dark. For the first time all night, the room felt real again. Kranz turned to the logbook, took the pencil from Bremer's hand, and wrote a single word. "Störsender?" Then he closed the book. Outside, the wind moved across the dunes, erasing footprints in the sand. Above the empty sea, no bombers flew, yet the first battle of electronic warfare had already begun. The men of Berta 7 did not yet know that what they had seen were not aircraft, but illusions born of aluminum strips, window fluttering down from British bombers hundreds of kilometers away, each strip cut to half the wavelength of Würzburg radar, each one a perfect false echo. They would learn soon enough. That night marked the first crack in German faith in technology, the moment when certainty turned to doubt, when precision instruments became ghosts. The Reich radar eyes had looked upon nothing and seen invasion, and the operators who once believed in the infallibility of their machines now stared into silence, wondering which was real, the empty sky above them, or the ghosts that still marched across their darkened minds. Night of July 24th to 25th, 1943. Over Hamburg, the sky burned. At 2300 hours, the first British pathfinders of Bomber Command's Group No. 8 crossed the Dutch coast, heading east toward the Elbe River. Behind them came waves of Avro Lancasters and Handley Page Halifaxes, nearly 800 aircraft in total. Each bomber carried not only incendiaries and high explosives, but a new and secret weapon, a handful of thin metallic strips, each cut precisely to a length of 27 centimeters. To the men in the aircraft, they looked like ordinary paper tinsel. To German radar, they would become ghosts. Inside Luftwaffe command centers along the North Sea, the Freya and Würzburg operators watched their screens drown in light. What the British called window, the Germans first saw as insanity. Dozens of radar stations, from Den Helder to Kiel, reported massed formations moving inland, merging, dividing, multiplying, each return identical, each altitude constant. No matter how the operators adjusted gain or range, the images persisted, filling the scopes with bright, solid echoes. The first night fighters scrambled from Gilse, Regen and Dielen airfields returned without firing a shot. Their radar controllers, overwhelmed by false tracks, vectored them into empty air. "Targets everywhere and nowhere," one pilot radioed, his voice shaking. "I see nothing but stars." He was told to keep looking. The Kammhuber Line, the pride of Germany's night air defense, was collapsing under invisible attack. General Josef Kammhuber had built his system with Prussian precision. Beginning in 1940, the Reich's western skies were divided into contiguous cells, each roughly 30 kilometers wide, protected by one Freya early warning radar, one Würzburg gun-laying radar, several searchlights, and a pair of twin-engined night fighters on alert. The concept was simple: detection, illumination, interception. It had worked flawlessly against the smaller British raids of the early war years. But that night over Hamburg, the logic of the system failed. The first bombers dropped their bundles of window every few seconds, thousands of metallic strips fluttering through the air, each one reflecting the Würzburg's microwave pulse just as effectively as an aircraft fuselage. To the radar, a single bomber became 100. 100 bombers became 10,000. Within minutes, the entire Kammhuber Line was blind. At the radar command center near Stade, Major Heinrich Peltz watched the confusion unfold. Reports from 22 stations came in simultaneously. Multiple raids, bearings 210 through 305. Altitude Angels 20. Estimated strength 600 to 1,000. Another voice interrupted. "No, they have divided. 2 separate streams heading north and south." A third shouted, "New raid detected, range 60 kilometers." Peltz slammed his fist on the map table. "Idiot! They're the same targets!" But he wasn't sure himself. When the night fighters finally made contact, it was by accident. Lieutenant Peter Spoden, flying a Messerschmitt 110 of Nachtjagdgeschwader 5, spotted flickers of flame far below the first fires of Hamburg. His onboard Liechtenstein radar, operating on a 53-centimeter wavelength, was also useless. Window flooded his scope with meaningless dots. Only by visual sighting did he close on a single Lancaster, shooting it down with cannon fire before disappearing into the inferno. "I saw the city burning before I saw the enemy," he wrote later. At 200 kilometers away, the men of Berta 7 and other coastal stations still fought their machines. The Freya scopes glowed solid green. The receivers howled with feedback. Technicians blamed each other, swapped vacuum tubes, adjusted antenna azimuths. Nothing changed. "It is as though the English have multiplied," one operator muttered. By dawn, the truth began to emerge. Prisoners captured from downed bombers described bundles of foil dropped in rhythm with flight time. Technicians retrieved fragments, thin strips of aluminum, light as dust, scattered across the fields of northern Germany. Scientists at Rechlin tested them against captured radar sets and confirmed the impossible. These little strips reflected radio waves perfectly, creating hundreds of false echoes. Kammhuber himself, summoned to Berlin that morning, faced Reichsmarschall Göring's rage. "You assured me our radar made the Reich invulnerable," Göring shouted, pounding the table. "And now you tell me the English destroy it with waste paper?" Kammhuber could only nod. The scale of the disaster grew by the hour. Over Hamburg, more than 40,000 civilians would die in the firestorm ignited by that night's raid. But within the Luftwaffe command structure, another kind of fire had begun, the collapse of faith. The radar operators who once trusted their screens now doubted every trace. The night fighter pilots who once obeyed vectors now questioned their controllers. The certainty of the Kammhuber Line, the mathematical precision of the Reich's air defense was gone. In the days that followed, technicians worked frantically to modify radar circuits. Engineers at Telefunken and Siemens tried filters to distinguish real targets from window echoes, but the chaff adapted. The bombers changed altitude, dropped new loads. British scientists countered every adjustment with new frequency cuts. For the first time, Germany realized the war in the air had become not only a battle of steel and fuel, but of signals and silence. At Berta 7, Kranz and his men were ordered to destroy all mention of Störsender from their logs. The official story would blame anomalous propagation, but the operators whispered otherwise. They had seen it. The instruments that once spoke truth now lied with perfect confidence. In his final entry that week, Bremer wrote only one line in his notebook, hidden beneath his bunk. The machines dream of enemies, and we believe them. That night, as new raids moved toward the Ruhr, the German radar network stared into a sky filled with ghosts. The green light of the screens no longer represented safety or knowledge. It was a mirror reflecting deception back into the eyes of those who had worshipped precision. The wall of night that Kammhuber had built was still standing on paper, its geometry untouched. But inside the glowing huts along the coast, the men knew the truth. The wall had been breached not by bombers, but by illusions falling softly through the dark. Autumn, 1943. The German radar network stretched from the Bay of Biscay to the Baltic like a nervous system of wires and pulses. Freya sets watched the horizon for intruders. Würzburg dishes locked their precise beams upon the echoes. Plotting boards turned electricity into geometry. The Luftwaffe had once believed this system infallible, a mechanical mind immune to fear or fatigue. But now the mind was hallucinating. In laboratories from Paris to Berlin, engineers stared at oscilloscopes filled with noise. The instruments no longer told the truth. After the nightmare of Hamburg, the word Störsender jammer was whispered like a curse through every radar station. British scientists, the Germans realized, had weaponized mathematics. At Telefunken's development center outside Berlin, Professor Ernst Kramer briefed a weary team. "The English have learned our frequencies," he said, pointing to a chalkboard filled with sine waves. "Freya operates near 1.2 meters, Würzburg around 53 centimeters. They are attacking us here." He tapped the board. "With power and with lies." The first technique, he explained, was barrage jamming. Allied aircraft transmitted continuous radio noise on German radar frequencies. To the operator, the scope filled with snow. The bright, clean pulses that marked aircraft returns disappeared inside a storm of static. Nothing could be tracked. The second method was deception jamming. Instead of noise, the enemy transmitted delayed copies of the radar's own signal back to it, making phantom targets appear at false ranges. Sometimes dozens of false echoes would bloom on the screen, each one convincing, each one alive. Then came masking. When the radar was flooded with interference, real aircraft hid within the glare. It was the electronic equivalent of blinding a searchlight with a mirror. To German technicians, these concepts sounded like sorcery. The Reich had pioneered radar before the war, believing it a purely defensive science precision, not trickery. The British had turned that precision into confusion. At the research station in Rechlin, trials began. Engineers set up captured British jammers' black boxes found in downed bombers and measured their output. Each transmitter radiated only a few hundred watts, yet when hundreds of bombers carried them, their combined power drowned out even the mightiest Würzburg beam. It was industrialized deception. The mathematics were brutal. A single Würzburg dish emitted about 10 kilowatts of pulsed energy. One bomber carrying a jammer could reduce its effective range by 10%. 10 bombers could blind it completely. The Allies did not need to outthink the Reich. They only needed to outproduce it. From captured documents, the Germans learned the names of their invisible enemies. Mandrel was the code name for the airborne jamming of early warning radars like Freya, creating vast corridors of blindness through which bomber streams could pass. Carpet jammed Würzburg's precise tracking frequencies, turning gun-laying radars into useless ornaments. Tinsel filled German voice channels with musical noise, garbling communications. And behind it all were the scientists of Britain's telecommunications research establishment, men and women working in quiet rooms filled with valves and cables, manufacturing illusion at industrial scale. In late October, the Luftwaffe tested countermeasures. Engineers tried narrowing the radar beam, altering pulse repetition frequencies, and even building new systems, the Freya Flamme, the Würzburg Dora. Each improvement brought a few weeks of clarity before the next Allied adaptation arrived. The enemy seemed always one step ahead. Inside the operational bunkers, morale cracked. Radar operators, once the elite of the Luftnachrichten troops, now doubted every echo. "The screen lies," wrote one controller in his private journal. "The enemy multiplies with mathematics." The problem was not just technical, it was psychological. For years, German propaganda had taught that technology was purity, that the machine was truth, and the human only its servant. Now the machines were treacherous. They spoke in false signals, convincing and confident, and the men could not tell fact from fiction. Meanwhile, the Allies refined their deception with scientific precision. By autumn, British factories were producing window-the-radar reflective chaff by the ton. Women working in assembly sheds cut aluminum strips of exact length, half the wavelength of German radar, bundled them into paper packages, and sent them to airfields. In the sky, each package became 1,000 false aircraft. A raid of 500 bombers might appear as 5,000. American factories soon joined in. The United States Army Air Forces, operating over the continent by 1944, brought their own jammers, powerful transmitters mounted in modified B-24 Liberators. These, electronic escorts, could project interference across hundreds of kilometers, saturating entire regions of German airspace. The mathematical foundation of radar had been simple: energy out, echo back, time equals distance. But the war had taught a new equation. If deception was multiplied by power and repetition, truth vanished. At a secret meeting in December 1943, General Kammhuber confessed to a handful of staff officers that the Reich air defense could no longer guarantee coverage. "Our line," he said, quietly, "has become a wall of mirrors." One of his subordinates asked what could be done. "Nothing," Kammhuber replied. "When your instruments lie, you can only close your eyes and listen for the bombs." By year's end, German technicians had recorded over 100 distinct jamming events. Some were localized bursts, others blanketed entire sectors. Each required fuel, power, and time to chase resources the Luftwaffe no longer had. The mathematics of deception had become the new arithmetic of war. Where once victory depended on bullets and engines, now it depended on kilocycles and decibels. The nation that could mass-produce lies faster than its enemy could correct them would rule the night. In early 1944, at Berta 7, the Freya scope once again filled with ghosts. Bremer and Kranz stared at the green circle, remembering that first night of confusion months before. Nothing had changed, only multiplied. Kranz closed the logbook without comment. He no longer bothered to write Störsender. It was no longer a question, it was the world. Outside, the wind moved over the dunes as it had that summer. The operators smoked in silence, their faces pale in the moonlight. Above them, invisible in the darkness, the Allied bombers crossed safely through the corridors of noise they had built, for themselves a symphony of deception written in radio waves, conducted by mathematicians, and played upon the instruments of war. Spring of 1944. In the darkened bunkers of northern France, the radar screens glowed as they always had circular eyes staring into the void. But to the men of the Luftwaffe's air warning service, those eyes had become blind. The Freya early warning sets and Würzburg tracking dishes still hummed and rotated. The operators still marked grease pencil lines across plotting boards. Yet the sense of certainty that once defined German air defense had dissolved into doubt. By April, the British and Americans had turned jamming into an art form. Their bombers no longer crossed the channel alone. They were escorted by phantom armies of signals, mandrel screens, carpet noise, and endless showers of window chaff that fell like metallic snow. To the radar crews along the coast, the sky itself had become treacherous. Every sweep of the scope revealed enemies that might not exist. At station Anton 5, near Boulogne, the night began like any other. Rain drummed on the corrugated roof, the sea wind howled against the dunes, and the operator on duty, Oberfeldwebel Ernst Hahn, sat hunched over his Freya console. The phosphorescent ring traced its endless circle, painting small bursts of light that rose and fell in rhythm. Hahn adjusted the gain, muttering to himself. For weeks, he had been chasing ghosts. At 22:15, the first wave appeared contacts bearing 230, range 200 kilometers, moving east. Within minutes, more followed. Hahn's supervisor, Lieutenant Rudi Schenk, came running. "How many?" he demanded. Hahn rubbed his eyes. "At least 500, perhaps more." Schenk leaned over the screen. The returns were strong, steady, perfect. "This must be the invasion," he whispered. He ordered the data relayed to the divisional command post at Saint-Omer. Within 5 minutes, the entire Kammhuber network was awake. Phones rang, teletype machines clattered, and across northern France, night fighters scrambled into the rain. But the aircraft were chasing phantoms. At radar posts from Dunkirk to Le Havre, the same story repeated. Hundreds of targets suddenly appearing, then vanishing, blips splitting and merging like living things, echoes moving at impossible speeds. Controllers gave vectors, pilots flew into empty skies, and anti-aircraft batteries wasted precious ammunition firing at nothing. At 2300, the duty officer at Saint-Omer, Major Franz Hegel, received 3 conflicting reports, one raid heading toward Paris, one toward Lille, and one toward the Pas de Calais. He studied the map in disbelief. "They cannot all be real," he muttered. A voice from headquarters barked over the line. "They are real enough. Engage them." But there were no bombers, only the whisper of rain and the hum of machines. Unbeknownst to Hegel, the British were conducting a full-scale rehearsal for the coming invasion, a deception operation code named Glimmer. Small groups of Royal Air Force bombers flew precise circles over the channel, dropping endless streams of window. The result on German radar was magnificent chaos, whole fleets of phantom ships and aircraft approaching the coast. The illusion was so perfect that German controllers believed they were seeing the opening of a massive Allied landing. Back at Anton 5, Hahn and Schenk listened to the growing storm of radio traffic. Voices overlapped controllers, shouting bearings, pilots demanding confirmation, gun crews requesting permission to fire. Every voice carried panic. "Can you see them on Würzburg?" Schenk asked. The tracking operator shook his head. "Nothing consistent. Every target fades before I can lock on." Schenk stared at the scope. The bright spots danced like mocking lights. "It's Störsender again," he said quietly. "All of it." The word felt poisonous. By midnight, the Phantom Armada had crossed the French coast on radar. At least. Reports of parachute drops, landing craft, and gliders filled the airwaves. The regional command ordered every available night fighter airborne. In truth, only a handful of British aircraft were in the sky, all dropping window in carefully timed intervals. Major Hegel realized the truth too late. By 2 in the morning, the raids had evaporated from his screens, replaced by silence. The fighters returned, low on fuel, having found nothing. In the morning briefing, a communications officer proposed the obvious. It was another deception. Hegel nodded grimly, and we believed every bit of it. In Berlin, the reports caused fury. Goering demanded explanations. The Luftwaffe's electronics branch blamed atmospheric conditions, but everyone knew the truth. The Reich's Great Wall of Radar, the Kammhuber Line, was no longer a line but a sieve. By May, new British jammers, Jostle and airborne Cigar were flooding German frequencies. These transmitters were so powerful that their signals could be heard as far away as Berlin, even through the static of German broadcast stations. Night after night, operators listened to their scopes drown in noise, while Allied bombers crossed unmolested. One technician at Rechlin described the sensation. "It is like going deaf while your house burns down." At Anton 5, Schenk tried to adapt. He reduced receiver sensitivity, changed pulse intervals, even modified antenna angles. Nothing worked. The interference shifted with him, as if the enemy knew his every move. And in a way, they did. Allied intelligence had mapped the German radar network in meticulous detail, using aerial reconnaissance, captured data, and decrypted signals. Each station's position, frequency, and even call sign were known. On June 5, 1944, Schenk's Freya screen once again came alive with hundreds of echoes. The invasion seemed to have returned. He sent the alarm, then paused, remembering all the false raids before. "Are they real this time?" Hahn asked. Schenk didn't answer. He simply watched as the blips advanced across the channel, stretching from Cherbourg to Calais, too wide, too perfect. "It's another trick," he said finally, but this time, part of it was real. Hours later, the true invasion, the Normandy landings, would begin farther west, while the German defences, blinded by false radar returns, stared toward the ghosts near Calais. The jammers had done their work. By dawn, the long coastal radar stations could see nothing but noise. Würzburg dishes tracked illusions. Freya scopes painted the channel solid green. The sky was alive with lies, and in that ocean of deception, the future of Europe was crossing the water unseen. At Anton 5, as the sun rose over the dunes, Schenk closed the station logbook. The final line he wrote that morning would never reach Berlin. The eyes of the Reich are open, but they see nothing. Summer of 1944. The once proud radar network of the Reich, spanning from Norway's fjords to the Mediterranean, now existed inside a storm of its own making. Every wavelength, every frequency band, every channel the Luftwaffe once controlled was filled with sound that was not sound, light that was not light. The Germans had entered a new realm of warfare, one fought not with bullets, but with electrons. In the underground command centre at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Paris, the flicker of oscilloscopes illuminated faces pale with exhaustion. The Kammhuber Line was gone, its sectors overrun not by tanks but by chaos. Allied bombers roamed the night in streams that defied interception. Their engines roared across the continent. Their echoes never appeared where they should. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Rathe, head of radar operations for Luftnachrichten Regiment 76, stood before a wall of static-filled screens. "We are deaf," he said almost to himself. His adjutant, Lieutenant Vogel, did not reply. He had heard the phrase too many times. Every night brought new forms of attack. The British now employed Carpet 2, a refined jamming technique that changed its frequency continuously, sliding like a phantom across the spectrum. The American 8th Air Force introduced Jostle 4, a 1-kilowatt transmitter mounted in a B-17 Flying Fortress that could drown out communications across half of Europe. The sky had become a transmitter, and the Reich's defences were its unwilling audience. The Germans fought back with desperate ingenuity. At Peenemünde, scientists working under Professor Hans Hollmann developed experimental anti-jamming filters and automatic gain controls, devices meant to distinguish true radar echoes from interference. Engineers at Rechlin proposed using very short wavelengths 10 centimeters and below to outpace the Allied jammers. They called the concept microwell, microwave radar. But such technology demanded components, magnetrons, waveguides, crystal detectors that only Allied industry could produce in sufficient quantity. Germany's factories, bombed daily and starved of rare metals, could not keep up. In the field, radar crews improvised. They learned to read patterns in the chaos, to sense the faint rhythm of real targets hiding beneath the static. At Würzburg-Riese Station, Clara 9, near Le Havre, Sergeant Karl Dörner developed a technique he called listening through the storm. By reducing the receiver sensitivity and slightly detuning the oscillator, he could sometimes glimpse a genuine aircraft echo amidst the noise. It was an art, not a science, a kind of divination performed by tired men staring into electronic snow. Still, the Allies owned the night. The airfields that once launched Germany's elite night fighters now stood half empty. The Liechtenstein radar sets in their noses were useless under jamming. Their once reliable ground controllers had become blind. Pilots like Oberleutnant Peter Spoden described flying through invisible enemy corridors. The radio shouted instructions, but they were lies. The screen was full of ghosts. You could feel the presence of bombers all around, but the instruments betrayed you. We were hunting shadows. Meanwhile, the British and Americans refined deception into precision. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Support Group operated aircraft solely dedicated to electronic warfare, Halifaxes, Sterlings, and Mosquitoes, packed with transmitters. They were known as heavies without bombs, but their effect was far deadlier than explosives. By blanketing German radar with false echoes, they turned the sky into a labyrinth. By late July, the Allies had created what they called the Corridor of Silence, a vast, jamming screen stretching from Cherbourg to the Rhine. Within it, radar could no longer function. The Luftwaffe's once meticulous defense map now looked like a medical scan of a dying patient, patches of blindness spreading across the body. In Berlin, despair turned to superstition. Officers spoke of Funkteufel radio devils haunting the ether. Old technicians from the early days of radio claimed that the Allies were using polarized waves, invisible to ordinary receivers, or magnetic fog that bent radar beams. Goering demanded explanations and results. He received equations instead, beautiful, meaningless lines of algebra that could not stop the bombers. Even within the chaos, there were flashes of grim insight. At the Telefunken laboratories, Dr. Wilhelm Runge, one of Germany's foremost radar pioneers, analyzed the jamming signals. "They are not random," he wrote. "They are intelligent. Each attack learns from the previous one. We are fighting not machines but minds." By August, Paris was lost, and with it the Western radar chain. Retreating units destroyed their equipment, smashing vacuum tubes, burning cables, burying the bronze waveguides in sand. The surviving operators fell back to the Reich frontier, setting up makeshift stations in church towers and railway tunnels. Their scopes glowed dimly on emergency power, painting meaningless constellations of light. Roth's last transmission from Saint-Germain was brief and bitter. "We can no longer distinguish real from false. The enemy has made truth impossible." The empire of noise had consumed everything. In the east, the same phenomenon spread. Soviet jamming units, trained by Allied technicians, began to disrupt German communications on the Eastern Front. Radio orders vanished into static. Artillery spotting became guesswork. Entire divisions marched blind through fogs of interference. For the first time, commanders spoke openly of technological defeat, not through lack of courage or fuel, but through deception itself. A weapon that could not be seen, touched, or heard had dismantled the structure of the Reich's defences. In September, as the Allies broke out of Normandy and advanced toward the Siegfried Line, the last coherent radar picture from Western Europe was transmitted from a Würzburg site near Aachen. The message read simply: "Multiple contacts, bearings unknown, all screens full." Then the signal faded into the universal hiss of static. The war that had begun with light beams and precision instruments ended in blindness and noise. Among the ruins of the radar huts, the soldiers left behind one phrase scratched into a concrete wall, discovered months later by Allied engineers: "Wir sahen alles und doch nichts." We saw everything, and yet nothing. It was the epitaph of an empire that had trusted its machines more than its men and had been defeated by silence disguised as sound. Winter of 1944. Snow covered the ruins of northern Europe, blanketing the shattered radar towers and bombed control bunkers in silence. The empire of noise had not only blinded Germany's defences, it had infected the very heart of its technological faith. What had begun as a war of men and machines had evolved into a war of ghosts. At an isolated Luftwaffe radar post near Bremen, Lieutenant Otto Schäfer sat before the flickering green scope of a Würzburg Riese set. The machine still hummed, though its purpose had long vanished. Allied bombers now crossed Germany nightly in waves too vast to counter. Schäfer had lost friends to the firestorms over Kassel, Darmstadt, and Dresden. He no longer believed the radar could save anything, yet orders were orders: maintain the watch, report all signals. On the evening of December 14th, as wind howled through the wrecked antenna masts, Schaefer's screen came alive. At first, he thought it was interference, those familiar curtains of static that jammers painted across the ether. But then the traces stabilized, perfect arcs, regular spacing, like an entire formation approaching from the northwest. Contact, bearing 310, range 100 kilometers, he reported. His sergeant looked up from a freezing desk. Impossible. The jamming has been constant all night. Schaefer frowned. It's clean. The echo grew stronger. 5 minutes later, the formation split into 2, then 4. Each cluster moved at different speeds, climbing and descending in mechanical harmony. No visual reports came from observation posts. No engine noise, no contrails. Only light on the radar screen. The pattern was so perfect, it felt wrong. Schaefer adjusted the range, then frequency, then pulse width. The echoes mirrored every change. It was as if the sky itself were answering him. He logged the event carefully. Unidentified radar returns possible enemy countermeasure experiment. Then, hesitating, he added a single word in pencil. Selbst? Ourselves? At Luftwaffe headquarters in Wunstorf, the reports multiplied. Dozens of radar stations across northern Germany had detected identical patterns. They called it der tanzende Himmel, the dancing sky. Analysts plotted the tracks and realized the impossible. The signals originated from no aircraft at all. They were artificial reflections, radar illusions broadcast deliberately. The Allies had gone beyond jamming. They were now creating ghosts. Captured documents after the war would reveal the truth. A new class of deception known as moonshine and corona operations. British transmitters, mounted on high-altitude Mosquito aircraft and ground stations in England, mimicked the pulse patterns of German radar returns. They could simulate entire bomber formations, complete with altitude and course variations. Some signals even responded when German operators tried to track them, designed to appear intelligent. To the men watching the scopes, it was sorcery. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe's radar network had become schizophrenic. Real bombers and false echoes overlapped until even the most experienced operators could not distinguish truth from trickery. Headquarters demanded verification through visual contact, but the night sky gave nothing back. One senior officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We have entered an age when machines speak lies more convincingly than men speak truth." In the laboratories of Telefunken, exhausted engineers worked through the nights, designing anti-ghost circuits. They attempted to build filters that would detect the subtle time-phase differences between real and counterfeit echoes. A young mathematician named Dr. Heinrich Findeisen proposed a new principle he called correlation, comparing consecutive radar pulses to find inconsistencies. But by the time the first prototypes were ready, the war was already lost. As Allied armies advanced through France and Belgium, mobile radar units were forced to retreat daily. Equipment was abandoned, buried, or destroyed. The once mighty Kammhuber Line existed now only in fragments, isolated, blinking eyes staring into the dark. At Berta 7, the old Dutch coastal station where it had all begun in the summer of 1943, only 2 men remained. The Freya set still operated, its tubes glowing faintly behind cracked glass. The sea wind blew through gaps in the walls, scattering papers across the floor. Sergeant Bremer, now 25, but aged beyond his years, kept the last logbook himself. The entries had grown shorter with each week, no reliable contacts, jamming continuous, fuel low, orders unclear. On February 23, 1945, he wrote his final report. Multiple phantom targets, identical to previous months, believed to be enemy artificial returns, no countermeasure available. The instruments lie completely now. He closed the notebook and laid it beside the Freya console. Then he switched off the set for the last time. The screen faded to black, leaving only the faint crackle of cooling circuits. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the night was truly silent. When Allied troops captured the Dutch coast in April, they found the station intact. Inside, The walls were covered with hand-drawn diagrams, waveforms, frequencies, strange patterns labelled Geisterseele ghost targets. One note, written in red pencil, read, "Truth destroyed by its own perfection." Historians would later call it the birth of electronic warfare, the moment when science learned to deceive itself. For the German technicians who had lived through it, the lesson was simpler and more human. The machines they had built to see through darkness had become the darkness itself. In the decades after the war, surviving radar engineers from both sides would meet at conferences and reunions. They would exchange laughter, papers, and cautious respect. At one such meeting in 1962, held in London, former Luftwaffe officer Ernst Hahn, once of Anton 5, spoke quietly over coffee with British engineer Robert Cockburn, one of the creators of Window. "You blinded us," Hahn said. Cockburn smiled sadly. "No, we taught your machines to dream." Hahn nodded slowly. "Yes, and they dreamed of ghosts." Outside, the rain fell softly against the windows, a sound not unlike static. The war of electrons was over, but its legacy had only begun. The world had learned that truth could be engineered and that, sometimes, the brightest screens could hide the deepest shadows. May of 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing like a dying wave. In Berlin, fires smouldered, where ministries once stood, and in the shattered countryside, the instruments of the Reich lay silent, its tanks, its aircraft, its radar towers. Yet even in the ruins, the ghosts of the machines lingered. At the edge of a forest near Wismar, a small detachment of British Royal Air Force engineers arrived to secure what Allied intelligence had marked as a special signals facility. They found a concrete bunker half buried in sand, the entrance blown open by retreating German troops. Inside were racks of twisted metal, coils of cable, and shattered cathode ray tubes. On one wall, half legible through soot, someone had scrawled a final message. "Wir hörten sie kommen, aber sie waren nie da." We heard them coming, but they were never there. Flight Lieutenant Alan Merriman, a radar officer who had spent the war jamming these very systems, stared at the words for a long time. "They never understood what we really did," he murmured. His sergeant glanced up from a pile of burned documents. "What was that, sir?" Merriman shook his head. "Nothing. Just ghosts." The bunker was one of dozens scattered across northern Germany, each once part of the great defensive web that had stretched across the continent. Now they were tombs. Inside, Allied intelligence officers found fragments of Würzburg schematics, radar operator logs, and the strange final notebooks of engineers who had tried to fight invisible enemies. Many entries ended with the same word, Störung, interference. In London, these captured records were examined by the scientists who had conceived Britain's countermeasures. For men like Robert Watson Watt, Edward Bowen, and R.V. Jones, reading those logs was like confronting their own reflections. "We deceived their machines so thoroughly," Jones wrote later, "that at last the men behind them began to question their own senses." The greatest victory of intelligence is to make the enemy doubt reality itself. Across Europe, the greatest victory of intentioner, Allies studied the remnants of the German radar empire. The Freya towers, tall and skeletal, rose like iron skeletons from the fields. The Würzburg Riese dishes' huge parabolic bowls of steel stood tilted against the sky, silent monuments to a vanished faith in certainty. The war had proven that information was not merely gathered, it could be bent, mirrored, and destroyed. Even as surrender terms were signed, the next war was already beginning in laboratories. The British scientists of the Telecommunications Research Establishment moved their work into secrecy, joined by American colleagues who had learned the power of deception. In Washington, the newly formed U.S. Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board began classifying all files relating to jamming, chaff, and radar countermeasures. In Moscow, Soviet engineers collected fragments of Würzburg systems and began building their own copies. The ghost of the machine had escaped its birthplace. For the German radar veterans who survived, life after the war was a strange silence. Men like Dr. Hans Hollmann and Wilhelm Runge found work in civilian radio and electronics. Some were taken to Britain and the United States under Operation Surgeon, quietly debriefed and re-employed. Yet none forgot the days when their instruments betrayed them. In 1953, in a small café near Bonn, a reunion of former Luftnachrichten officers gathered for the first time since the war. They raised their glasses not to victory or valor but to memory. Lieutenant Otto Schäfer, who had once watched ghosts dance across his Würzburg scope near Bremen, spoke softly. "We believed we were building eyes for the Reich, but what we built were mirrors." No one contradicted him. By then, radar had already been reborn as the nervous system of the Cold War. Air defense networks stretched from Greenland to Turkey, and new weapons-guided missiles, supersonic jets depended entirely on invisible waves. Yet in every command, bunker, operators still faced glowing screens that could lie as easily as they once had in 1943. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, American technicians monitoring early warning radars reported phantom aircraft formations approaching from the north. For half an hour, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, triggered by echoes in the sky that were never real. Some of those men, veterans of the Second World War, recognized the pattern instantly. "It's window all over again," one said. The ghosts had returned. Historians would later trace the lineage of modern electronic warfare directly to that summer night in 1943, when the crew of Berta 7 first saw impossible swarms on their screens. Every jammer, every stealth system, every false signal in the decades to come owed its birth to that moment when truth fractured under the weight of illusion. At the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., a section of a German Würzburg radar dish now stands beside a gleaming Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the same aircraft type that once carried jammers in the Pacific. The placard reads, "The Birth of Electronic Warfare." Yet beneath the technical language, the frequencies, the power outputs, the range equations, lies something deeper, a story about belief. The men of the Luftwaffe radar service had believed that technology was truth made visible. The men who deceived them had learned that technology could also be a lie told beautifully. Between those two ideas, the modern world was born. Before leaving the ruined station at Wismar, Flight Lieutenant Merriman walked back into the bunker one last time. He placed a small brass tag on the console, a maintenance plate taken from a British jamming transmitter. On it was stamped a single line, "Property of His Majesty's Government, serial number 7J, 100. He set it beside the German inscription on the wall and whispered, "You saw ghosts, but they were ours." Outside, dawn rose over the Baltic. The sea was calm, and the radio static had finally stopped. But in that silence, the echoes still lived, faint, mathematical, eternal. The age of radar had ended in illusion, and the age of illusion had only just begun. Autumn of 1965. 2 decades had passed since the war's end, yet in the laboratories of every great power, the echoes of the radar battle still pulsed quietly beneath the hum of oscillators and the glow of vacuum tubes. What had begun as a contest of antennas and pulse widths had become the foundation of a new invisible frontier, the electromagnetic battlefield of the Cold War. In a windowless room at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, England, a group of young engineers studied flickering traces on a scope not so different from the ones their fathers had watched in the bunkers of the Reich. Among them was 29-year-old physicist Margaret Elson, born the same summer British bombers had dropped window over Hamburg. Her supervisor, a gaunt veteran named Dr. Robert Cockburn, leaned over her shoulder as she adjusted the gain. "There," he said softly, "you see that flutter at 3.2 gigacycles? That's not an aircraft. That's a reflection we created." "You mean a ghost?" she replied. He smiled faintly. "Yes, but this time it's ours." They were testing an experimental active decoy, a small, self-contained transmitter designed to imitate the radar signature of a bomber and confuse Soviet defenses. It was the great-grandchild of the window bundles that had once fallen like silver rain over Europe. Where the wartime jammers had shouted over enemy radar, these new devices whispered, copying the language of detection so perfectly that machines could no longer tell friend from fiction. The project, codenamed Raven Light, was born from the lessons of the Ghost War. The British engineers had read the captured German logs and understood something profound. Deception was not merely a tactic but a philosophy. If one could control what a machine believed, one could control what men believed too. Across the ocean, in the United States, similar work was unfolding. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Colonel William Pannell briefed a small team of scientists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Lincoln Laboratory. On the blackboard behind him were 3 words written in chalk: radar, jamming, stealth. "The Germans taught us what happens when you depend on your instruments," Pannell said. "Now we're building machines that can't be seen at all." He was referring to Project Harvey, a classified program exploring how to reduce radar cross-section through shape and materials. The engineers joked that they were trying to build a plane that could hide from its own shadow. But within those jokes lay an inheritance from the radar battles of 1943. The war had proven that visibility was no longer a matter of light and shadow, it was a matter of belief. In Moscow, Soviet scientists were learning the same lesson. Engineers at the NII-17 Institute, many of whom had studied captured Würzburg and Freya sets, were now building massive over-the-horizon radars to detect Western bombers. Their adversaries responded with new generations of jammers, carried by aircraft like the B-52 and the nimble EF-111 Raven. The sky was once again filled with deception, this time global, continuous, and permanent. By the 1970s, the electromagnetic spectrum had become the most valuable territory on Earth. Invisible wars raged every hour: radar against jammer, missile against decoy, truth against illusion. Yet, beneath the equations and the classified briefings, a quiet unease lingered among those who truly understood the legacy they had inherited. At a NATO symposium held in Bonn in 1974, former adversaries met again scientists from Britain, America, and West Germany, some of whom had once fought each other in the ether. Among the attendees was Professor Heinrich Findeisen, the mathematician who had once tried to build anti-ghost filters for the Luftwaffe. His presentation was titled "The Problem of Perception in Automated Defense Systems." He began with an image of a radar screen filled with false echoes. "Gentlemen," he said in his soft Rhineland accent, "this is not 1943, this is next year. The more intelligent our machines become, the easier they are to deceive, because deception is nothing more than exploiting expectation. The ghost in the machine never left it learned to speak binary." The audience sat in uneasy silence. After the conference, Findeisen met privately with Elson, who had presented on adaptive jamming algorithms. They walked along the Rhine in the fading light. "Do you ever think," he asked, "that we've built a world where no signal can be trusted?" Elson hesitated. "Perhaps that's just the price of knowing too much." He smiled sadly. "No, it's the price of forgetting what knowledge is for." By the end of the decade, electronic warfare had evolved into a science of pure abstraction. Satellites listened from orbit, intercepting whispers of radar and radio. Computers processed signals faster than human thought. The first stealth prototypes, angular, faceted machines that scattered radar waves like broken mirrors, took shape in secret hangars. Yet for all its sophistication, it was the same ancient contest that had begun on the Dutch coast when a handful of German operators saw phantom bombers dancing across their screens. Machines still sought certainty in the noise, and other machines still made the noise sing. In 1985, at a veterans' reunion in Phoenix, Arizona, a thin man with silver hair and a quiet voice took the podium. It was General Adolf Galland, once commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. The audience included Americans, British, and Germans alike. "When we laughed at those fat American fighters," Galland said, "we believed war was about speed and courage. We learned too late that war had already moved into the invisible. Today, you fight with signals, and tomorrow you will fight with silence. Remember this: the first casualty of every technological war is truth. The room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning, a sound not unlike radio static. Outside, the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in bands of red and gold. Somewhere far above, satellites scanned the Earth with radar beams invisible to the eye, measuring oceans, tracking storms, and watching for enemies that might not exist. The inheritors of silence, the engineers, pilots, and mathematicians of the modern age, continued their work beneath fluorescent lights, chasing clarity through static, and perhaps, if one listened closely in the hum of their machines, one could still hear an echo from that long-ago night in 1943, when the sky over Europe filled with ghosts and the age of certainty came to an end.